Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to move on to chapter 3. And now we're going to go back to talking about the subconscious, and we're going to really talk about the nature of the connection between the subconscious and God. Right? We're going to learn what happens when your subconscious connects more to God, and what it feels like and how to do it. And I titled the chapter Spiritual Energy, which really is just a way of talking about that connection. And I'll talk more about that particular term later in the chapter. So just to go over it, a little bit of review. So we talked in chapter 1 about the nature of transcendental connection, right? So this is basically an ability your subconscious has to connect to things in the universe, right? So your subconscious is already connected to everything in the universe and all people on the planet, right? But it is only weakly connected to those things. But the subconscious has the ability to increase that connection, and when it does, it tends to take on the properties or imitate the nature of what it's connected to. Right? So to go over this first point, this first point is very consequential, is something that is pretty much a consequence of how I defined transcendental connection and what the subconscious is, but I don't think I mentioned it in chapter 1. So the subconscious is connected not only to all things in this reality, but also all things in a metaphysical reality. So very important, right? Because the subconscious, as we said, is metaphysical, right? It is not a purely physical substance. So not only does the subconscious have the ability to interact with physical things, which it does through our body, and can also do outside of our body, but it also has the ability to connect to transcendentally connect to metaphysical things, so things in a metaphysical reality. And what that ultimately means is that it's connected to everything in a metaphysical reality everywhere, just like it's connected to everything everywhere in a physical reality. And it has the ability to increase that connection to turn things into metaphysical reality. But one interesting consequence of that, which some people may not like, but this is how the universe works, is the subconscious is also connected to all beings, or you may call them all spirits in the metaphysical reality, right? And it has the ability to increase its connection to any one of those spirits as well, right? Just like it can increase its connection to different people. So I know that might make some people a little uncomfortable, but again, that is how the universe works in the metaphysical reality. It's almost like the metaphysical reality is like almost like the universe's internet service, right? It's the internet infrastructure. And you can use that sort of internet infrastructure to connect to any different place in reality or person, right? And that's talked about in near-death experiences a lot. But there's more to this, which we're going to break down. But before I go into it further, there's one other thing I want to talk about, and that's this guy, and that's that transcendental connection preserves volatility, not only to subjects, but also in terms of frequency. So that's something I don't think I mentioned about the frequency thing in chapter 1, but that's very important. We're going to go over it now. So just for a little bit of review, so we talked about how subconscious volatility is basically a term I use to talk about the affinity that your subconscious has to want to enter its excited state, right? So the body basically will keep the subconscious in the ground state, and volatility measures how much it wants to leave that state and how much energy it uses to express itself when it's out of that state, right? So a good analogy is to think of it as a vibrating particle, right? Almost like something that has a lot of thermal energy. So, or a lot of heat. So if I were to say, you could really just say kinetic energy also, right? So if I were to imagine an object, right? Let's say it's stuck here, or the subconscious, I should say, is in its ground state. If it only has a little bit of volatility, then when it finally leaves its ground state, it'll do something like this. Right? You can imagine this being a moving object with kinetic energy. Then it goes back, right? Because that's how the subconscious works. It always goes back after a few seconds. But now let's say it has a huge amount of volatility. It wants to really leave its ground state really badly. And when it finally does, it'll go up here and start doing like this, shaking around like crazy. So you can almost think of it as having a lot more kinetic energy. So that describes its volatility. Now, when we say transcendental connection preserves volatility, what we mean is that, let's say there's some person who has charged their subconscious to feel I don't know, the feeling of inner peace, right? Which I like to use a lot. They have charged the subconscious at the inner peace frequency. So they have a huge charge. Well, what this is how this theory works, right? So if I transcendentally connect to that person and my subconscious imitates their subconscious, what that means is my subconscious will have volatility relative to the frequency of inner peace and also relative to subjects. So if that person feels a lot of the charge of emotion when they focus on nature or something, right, then my subconscious will also have a lot of volatility or be able to charge very quickly, right, or more quickly when I focus on nature or something like it. But what's important here is not only that the transcendental connection preserves the behavior of my subconscious when I focus on the same subject as this person with the charge, but it also preserves the frequency I'm volatile at the same as that person. So what that means is that when I focus on some serene environment like that person, I will have an easier time charging the inner peace frequency, not some other frequency, but the inner peace frequency, the same as that guy. And so, basically, like I said before, that's very important because that's not something we've seen before. Normally, volatility occurs as a result of you charging your subconscious, right? So your short-term memory is filled with positive memory at the inner peace frequency, and that makes your subconscious highly volatile. But it can also become highly volatile as a result of being connected to someone, transcendentally connected to someone. And in that case, we don't even have a charge yet, but how that volatility would express itself is in a kind of bias or increased ability, or kind of a boost in your ability to charge the inner peace frequency while focused on the same subject that other persons focus on. So it's similar, like I said, similar to the effect of mood, right? If you're in a certain mood, which reflects passive memory, you would experience a kind of boost in your ability to charge a particular frequency. So that same thing happens here with transcendental connection. And even if I don't focus on that subject, I would still experience a kind of mood boost to charge that frequency to some degree if I'm more connected to that person, right? So these 2 points are very important because they combine together to get this third point. So this third point is the fact that the spirit realm or the metaphysical reality is bifurcated in terms of frequency. So that's super important, and that's going to basically establish how we think of the spirit realm or metaphysical reality and how we think of our connection to God. Now, a lot of what I'm going to say is highly theoretical. I'm not necessarily doing what you might call the proof for it. Like, I think I was able to do the proof, something like a proof, a logical analysis that's like a proof, similar to, I think I was able to do a lot of that in book 1. So a lot of book 2 is going to start very theoretical, but I think as you accept these ideas, right, if you presume them to be true, you're going to notice that a lot of it is going to, using it, that framework, a lot of what you hear about spirituality and spiritual experiences, including near-death experiences, a lot of it's going to make sense. So I think a lot of it is justified purely by the semi-empirical data. So I've spoken about that in the last chapter. So how do we get to this idea, right, that the spirit realm is bifurcated in terms of frequency? Well, it's bifurcated in terms of frequency along positive and negative frequencies, right? Meaning that the spirit realm is kind of broken up into the sort of positive realm and it's broken up into the sort of negative realms. And the deeper you go into a positive realm, the less connected you're going to be to the negative realm, and vice versa. And so you could kind of go one direction or the other, but not really both. So where that comes from is what we talked about in terms of antithetical frequencies, right? So we talked about how there are certain frequencies that are very difficult to charge at the same time, right? So the love frequency and the hate frequency, right? Let's say romantic love. It's very difficult to focus on a girl and charge the feeling of romantic love, just go very, very far in that charge, or charge it very intensely, but at the same time also charge the hate frequency very intensely. It's very difficult to do that. In a sense, they're opposite or antithetical frequencies. Now, it would be very easy to charge the feeling of love and also charge a feeling of having fun with the girl, or even the sexual frequency, right? So love is actually a precursor to the sexual frequency. We're going to talk a little more about that, I think a little bit in this chapter, but also we're going to talk about it in terms of its opposite, what happens when you don't do that, and I think chapter 5. But yeah, so those frequencies are very easy to charge together, right? But it would be very hard to charge love and the hate frequency together. Now, what we also mentioned is that all positive frequencies are basically antithetical to all negative frequencies. And so that basically, well, actually, before I say a little more, let's say you deep charge some positive frequency, anyone. If you charge it very, very intensely, you're going to be in a great mood, right? Because of the effect of passive memory. Now, when you're in that wonderful mood, it's still possible for you to feel negative emotions, but it's harder, right? Because the positive memory is dampening your ability to charge negative emotions. Similarly for the reverse, right? If you're in a really terrible mood, that means you've deep charged a negative frequency, and the passive memory is affecting you, stimulating you to feel negative emotions. If you're in a bad mood, it's hard to experience a positive emotion. You can still experience it, but that you can't feel it that much. And that's because the negative deep charge is dampening your ability to charge at a positive frequency. So it's hard to do both. The more you do one, the less you get of the other. So I argue that the spirit realm works exactly the same way. The more you charge, you charge a positive frequency, I argue that the spirit realm is bifurcated in terms of frequency. So the deeper you go into the positive layers of the spirit realm, the harder it is to feel anything negative. So where does that come from? What is the analysis, the logical analysis to make that claim? Well, I'm going to kind of break it down in a highly elaborate way. And like I said, it's very elaborate, but I think once you understand, you'll kind of see where I'm coming from once you hear the whole thing. So to understand that, I want to focus on the idea of transcendental connection and some consequences of it that we haven't really spoken about yet. So let's say, right, so we talked about how you can connect to beings in this realm, right? You could transcendentally connect to different beings, and your subconscious will take on or imitate the properties of who you connected to. So now let's say what the example I want to give, or the framework, the logical framework I want to set up, is let's say that there are 7 beings, right? So there's 7 beings, and each one of those beings also has a subconscious. So I believe spirits, right, have a subconscious mind, works the exact same as ours. We're also a spirit inhabiting a physical body. But let's say that there are spirits in this realm, 7 of them, and all of them are charged up at a positive frequency. Let's call it the universal love frequency, right? And we'll call these beings angels since their frequency is positive. And there are each angel, we'll call them angels 1, angel 2, angel 3, angel 4, angel 5, 6, and 7. Now each angel is charged up at progressively greater levels of a positive frequency. So what that means is that angel 1 is charged up at the universal love frequency to a certain level of intensity, but pretty much at the lowest level of intensity of all of them. And then angel 2 is charged up at a significantly higher level of intensity at the universal love frequency. And then angel 3 is charged up at a significantly higher frequency than angels 2 and 1, but is charged up at a less intense frequency than angel 4. And so on and so forth, right? So each one is charged up at a progressively higher, or their charge has much greater intensity than the angels below it. Until you get to angel 7, which just has the highest frequency, or has the greatest intensity of their subconscious energy charge at the universal love frequency. So now let's say that I, as a person, as a human, right, on the planet, I decide to transcendentally connect to this angel. Now forget how I do that, what I did to do that. Let's just say that I did that. If I increase my transcendental connection to this angel, what's going to happen is that my subconscious is going to experience an ability to have an easier time charging at the universal love frequency. But remember, because this preserves volatility, I will also have an easier time charging up until I reach the same level of intensity, right, as the angel. And what we can even say is that because transcendental connection is based on a sort of imitation, my subconscious imitating or behaving in a likeness of the nature of this angel, and because it preserves volatility, we can say that my transcendental connection increases. It gets closer and closer, or I should say I connect more and more to the angel as I charge more and more at the universal love frequency. So at the even that connection is giving me a boost, is giving me an easier time charging. It's allowing me to charge up at the universal love frequency more easily, but also my connection to the angel is increasing as I charge up at the universal love frequency more and more. And my subconscious is imitating the angel in other ways, the state of their subconscious. Now, what's going to happen when I actually, well, I'll just say it, when my subconscious charges to reach the same level of intensity as that angel, right? I'm the most connected to the angel. So I was less connected to the angel when I had a lower level of intensity, and as I kept charging intensity to match the angels, I was most connected. Now, transcendental connection is not necessarily based on the charge itself. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. But as the connection increases, as my subconscious, the intensity of my charge matches theirs. Now, here's what's interesting, though. What happens if I try to increase my charging intensity past the level of that angel? Well, would the transcendental connection increase or decrease? Right? Well, when it was lower, my charging intensity was lower than the angels, and I was less connected to the angel, then it's probably going to decrease a little when I charge it past the level of intensity of the angel. That is not to say I'm no longer transcendentally connected to the angel. You're transcendentally connected to everyone, right? But if I keep charging the intensity higher, then I will become a little less connected to that particular angel. Now, let's say at that point I focus on angel 2. And I transcendentally connect to that angel. Now that angel has a higher charging intensity, so a higher level of volatility than angel 1. So I'll experience a boost and I'll have an easier time charging my subconscious at the universal love frequency to reach the volatility or the charging intensity of angel 2. And once I reach that level, now I'm most connected to angel 2. So I'm more connected to angel 2 than I am angel 1, even though I'm still connected to both of them. Now let's say I play this game again and I do it with each angel. So when I reach angel 3, I'm more connected to angel 3 than I am angels 2 and 1. Right? And I can keep playing this game over and over until I get to angel 7. Now here's the interesting thing, is when I'm connected to angel 7, again I'm still connected to all the other angels, 6 through 1, but I'm more connected to angel 7. And then if I drop in charging intensity, let's say I decide to transcendentally connect to angel 4 again. Then I reduce in intensity until my charging intensity pretty much matches angel 4. And now I'm more connected to angel 4 than I was angel 7 and 6 and 5 and the rest of them. And so you can see this idea of becoming more connected to a being or an angel as you match their intensity, you can see it kind of has a similar effect to what we talk, a similar parallel to the idea of what's called the zeroth law of thermodynamics. So I just thought that was interesting. I don't really want to go into that, but if you're familiar with that law, you might see some kind of interesting parallel here. I haven't really thought about it too much, but it reminded me of that connection. But just to go back into analogy, I just wanted to get that out there and mention that. You see something very interesting happening, right? I have the ability to connect to these beings on the basis of frequency and charging intensity. And I have the ability to actually become less connected or more connected to these beings based on charging intensity. And in fact, I think I mentioned that in chapter 1 when I said all people on the planet are transcendentally connected to each other. We're more connected to each other than animals based on how much our subconscious imitates each other. And humans exist in this particular range of charging intensity, right? So in the metaphysical realms, they can reach levels of charging intensity way beyond ours. It's not even a little bit close, but at least at the higher levels. But if a human decides to charge their subconscious at a higher level of intensity, of some positive frequency, they would start to become a little less connected to the rest of the humans on the planet, but they would still be connected to them overall. And our connection to humans is based on other things. We wouldn't ever charge so high that we disappear and go in the spirit realm, because what keeps us here is something different, right? In a nutshell, it has to do with the density of energy here and our connection to our body, which is not based... There's more to talk about. That'll actually make a little more sense based on what we talk about in chapter 8. But suffice it to say, the density and our connection to our body is not based on a transcendental connection. So we can always keep connecting to higher realms. But if we do connect to higher realms and our energy goes very, very high, our charging intensity, you would add positive energy to the superconscious of the world, which helps other people to charge positively. So that's a good thing. But one thing I want to ask now is something very interesting. Is it possible for me to keep playing this game of sort of becoming less transcendently connected to people who have a less charging intensity by charging to some being who has a greater intensity of charge, right? So can I charge, in that example, Angel 7 was the highest, but is it possible for me to go higher? Is there an Angel 8, an Angel 9, an Angel 10? Can I keep just becoming more transcendently connected to a higher being and less transcendently connected to all these lower beings with a lesser intense charge? How high does it go? Can I go on forever, right? So ultimately, the answer to that question is that there is a limit, right? So this is a theory. There is a limit. There is a highest being, highest being or a highest reality, right? And the highest you can possibly go is a being who, in theory, has infinite charging intensity, or the subconscious has infinite volatility, right? And despite what Buzz Lightyear told you, right, there is nothing beyond infinity. So if we assume that infinity is the highest possible level of charging intensity and that it exists, infinity is not really a number, but if we presume that there is a being with infinite charging intensity and infinite volatility at the universal love frequency, then we would really just focus on that being, because that being is still connected to everything, and as we transcendentally connect to that being more and more and more, we could technically increase we could technically increase our subconscious volatility by transcendentally at the universal love frequency by charging to Angel 1 or Angel 2, Angel 3, but we can just kind of skip all that and go right to the source, the one who has the greatest charging intensity. And then we could just connect to that person, because that person is also connected to everyone just like the angels are. And so that source, obviously, or ultimately, is God, right? So just to go over this next point, the source is the limit of positive charge and has infinite positive volatility. So, in other words, we use different universal love frequency, but the source, or God, is infinitely volatile at all positive frequencies, which we'll talk about that in a moment. So now to go over this point, why do I say that reality is bifurcated? Well, because there's another consequence which I didn't necessarily mention in the example. So there are actually two consequences that kind of lead to this idea. So the first is to recognize that in the example I was talking about transcendentally connected to one angel. However, remember what we said. Your subconscious is connected to all beings in all the universe, right? So metaphysical and physical. So in this metaphysical realm, let's say there are trillions and trillions of beings. Who knows how many there are, but trillions of spirits who are at the same level of charging intensity as Angel 1. Then technically I'm a little bit more connected to all of them, right? More so than all the trillions of beings at level 2 and at level 3 and at level 4. And even within that level, or that section of beings at the charging intensity level of Angel 1, there's even sections, you could say, of beings who are more charged up at, let's say, the inner peace frequency than the universal love frequency. So if I decide to start charging at the inner peace frequency at the same intensity as that Angel 1 was charged up at the universal love frequency, I would transcendentally connect to that frequency as well, to the beings in that range. And so what you can see, before I get into it, you can see that there are different frequencies that exist, all different types of frequencies that exist at the level of charging intensity for Angel 1. But also, you can say that in the spirit realm, as it isn't physical matter, it does not have the density of this realm. And this is confirmed in many near-death experiences and many spiritual experiences. It'll make more sense also when we talk about the nature of Chi in Chapter 8. In spirit realm, reality is pretty much formed by thoughts, right? So we talked about how this reality has a relative component to it. You can get away with ignoring it, but it still has a relative component. But that relative component is much more exaggerated in the spirit realm because it has such less density. So the spirit realm is influenced by thought. So basically, I mentioned that to say that we're not dealing with space-time in the same way we're dealing with space-time here. There's not this question of space, or like Angel 1 and Angel 2 aren't taking up the same space where they're kind of clashing with each other. It has nothing to do with space, at least in that same concept. Reality is formed by thought and by charging intensity and frequency, right? So all I got to do to get to this section of reality and spirit realm is connect to some being that has a certain level of charging intensity and a certain frequency. And so, or if I just have it myself, I'll go there. And that's something also talked about in near-death experiences. So what I kind of like to think about it is almost like a diagram, kind of like a light cone. So in special relativity, there's a concept of a light cone, which, if my memory serves me, basically talks about the range of influence, right? Has the speed of light travels a certain distance within a certain amount of times. There's a certain range of possible events that can occur that could be affected by that light. Anything outside the light cone can't possibly be affected by that, whatever event occurred that's at the center of the light cone. So, and it kind of looks something like this, which is not too important if you're not familiar with it. So that's kind of how I like to think of it. And so I like to think of it as being layers like this. So my diagrams are pretty terrible, but so this would be layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and then so on and so forth. And then these would be the lower layers, which we didn't talk about yet. But these lower layers would be lower layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3. So if we assume that reality is formed by thought and that we're more transcendentally connected to millions of beings at each level, right, then the other levels, whatever level most matches our charging intensity, then we could kind of see kind of this formation of different layers of realities forming. So the higher realities, which you can almost think of as the heavens, represent charging intensities at higher levels of a positive frequency. And so reality forms and manifests, which will make more sense when we talk about manifestation chapter 10, but reality forms and manifests in a positive way in the heavenly realms. And then the lower realms, which are the hellish realms, you progressively get higher and higher in the negative charging intensity, right? So again, all very theoretical, but I believe this is all confirmed in spiritual experiences. So if you read about them, you'll kind of see some version of this playing out. Now, at the highest level, so we'll just say level 7, we'll just give it a number, that represents infinite charging intensity, right? Which is the source, which is God. So, like I said, instead of, to go over this next point, as you charge the subconscious positively more and more, you transcendentally connect to God more and more, right? So, I don't, instead of trying to connect to this being and this being and this being, I'll just go all the way to the source. So God is connected to everybody, right? And as I connect to Him more and more, I take on His properties more and more. So we're going to talk about what that means for the subconscious to imitate the nature of God. In the simplest sense, it means you feel the feeling of goodness more and more, and you behave really in the most pure way. I just consider it to be you behave in the likeness of Jesus Christ. And you're going to feel it once you start practicing this. But you're going to notice the change in your behavior and what you feel compelled to do. But so if God has the most intense charge, or let's say He has a subconscious, right? Let's say His subconscious has the highest volatility, right? The infinite charging intensity at a positive frequency, then in theory, as long as I'm charging my subconscious at a positive frequency and making that charge more and more and more intense, I'm technically transcendentally connecting more and more and more to God. So we talked about that with this diagram here. So let's say that now, according to this theory, God is the source of all positivity. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that God is connected to everything. So He's connected not only to these realms, He's also connected to these realms too, the lower realms, the hellish realms. However, God, the essence, the pure essence of what God is, though, which this has to do with the nature of truth, right? Truth itself, I think I mentioned before. Excuse me, I think I mentioned it before. Truth itself is a supernatural expression of God's will and expresses itself in three forms, which has to do with God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These realms don't contain truth. We'll talk more about that with, again, when we talk about the relative nature of reality. But for the moment, we'll just say the most pure essence of what God is the source of all positive frequencies. So if I increase my connection to God, in theory, or if I charge some positive frequency more and more and more, then in theory I'm transcendentally connecting to God more. But we did the universal love frequency, right? So in theory, if my theory is correct, then I should be able to pick another positive frequency. Let's say I pick romantic love. I pick the love frequency and I keep making it more positive or charging it more intensely. Does that mean I'm connecting to God more and that my subconscious is taking on his properties more? And that one, I thought about this, and it's like, I technically could say that's true, but something doesn't quite feel right. So for example, if I just focus on, so we talked about how charging, for the moment we'll say charging power, when you charge something more and more, there are two parameters that determine its intensity, right? So we talked about the burst action, which is the intensity component, but also we talked about the purity component. So in other words, if I make my subconscious more and more, so forgetting the burst action for a moment, because that doesn't really matter in this discussion, we're talking about the purity component. If I make my subconscious more and more and more pure at the love frequency, does that mean I'm connecting to God more and more? So if it gets more pure, if I get super purity, then I'm basically much closer to having a charge or being connected to God. That doesn't quite feel right to me, right? I could make that argument and kind of go off that framework, but something feels like it's missing to me because I've done the charge. I've done it many times, and that's not quite what it feels like. I know what it feels like to connect to God and increase my connection to him, and it doesn't feel like it's as simple as just charging any positive frequency to a very intense level. Right? I can make it very, very pure where it is, and that still doesn't feel like how it feels when I connect to God, and I feel the purity then. It's much higher. So something's missing. Something isn't quite right here. And to recognize this isn't quite right would require experience, right? So might be hard to notice it from a purely logical analysis, but I know this from experience charging my subconscious all the time and charging it to connect to God and seeing what that feels like. And so the thing that's missing is actually a fourth component of quantization. So to go over this next point, transcendental connection to God is the fourth component of quantization. So what that means is that we talked about how, so far in book one, we only talked about three components of quantizing the subconscious, right? So we talked about intention, we talked about frequency, we talked about intention, we talked about frequency, and we talked about organization, right? And organization was mostly, it was there the whole time, but we could get away with kind of ignoring that component of it. Even the stories you tell in your mind have a component of organization to them. But you really needed organization for highly complex compulsions, and that had to do with creativity and intelligence. But what we were doing in all of book one that I didn't mention is that we were talking about how to charge the subconscious in the sense, with the understanding that you're keeping the fourth component of quantization fixed, right? So everything we said kind of only makes sense if the fourth component is fixed in some neutral range that reflects the normal range it is for us humans. What we didn't talk about is what happens when that fourth component, the value starts changing and it isn't fixed. Because it's going to affect the other three. The fourth component is almost like the master component. It's actually the one that's most important. So the fourth component of quantization actually represents your connection to God. So when you increase that fourth component, right, it can increase or decrease. When you increase the fourth component, meaning you become more connected to God, what actually happens is very interesting. You're going to notice that your ability to experience all positive emotions increases, just like the essence of what God is. So you start to match the essence of God, the most pure essence of what he is. Now, God is infinitely charged at every positive frequency, so he has infinite volatility at all frequencies. So when you increase your connection to God, you're going to notice your ability to feel all frequencies or all positive emotions just increases, which is wonderful, right? That's what happens when you transcendentally connect to God more, which we're going to talk about how to do that later, and you're going to verify this through your experience. But what happens when that value drops is you're going to notice that your ability to feel all positive emotions decreases, right? It doesn't matter what positive emotion it is, you're gonna notice you just can't feel it as much. And your ability to feel all negative emotions increases, right? So that's what happens when your connection to God weakens. So humans stay at a fairly normal range, or at a certain range within their terms of their transcendental connection. They don't go too high up and they don't go too far down. But we're going to talk about how to increase this to a much higher level than probably most people usually make it to. And we're going to talk about what happens when you increase that connection to higher levels, what the experience is like. Now, we're not going to talk about the low levels, what happens when that connection drops very low, which is not something you would ever want to do, but we're going to talk about what happens when you do it, because it does happen to people. But we're going to talk about that mainly in chapter 5, where we talk about negative entities, because that's pretty much the whole, that's what the whole thing is going to be about. Negative entities are basically the cornerstone of that whole experience, what happens when your negative, this component drops to lower levels. But we might talk a little bit about it also later in this chapter, but we won't go into too much detail yet. So yeah, that's the fourth component. That's mainly what this chapter is going to be about, is that fourth component and how to change it, or mainly your connection to God, and how to increase it, right? And what happens when you increase it. And that's really what I mean by the term spiritual energy. That refers to that connection. And so to go over this last point, in NDEs, people report feeling more love and more joy than they've ever experienced in life, right? And so in the Bible, there's a verse which says, the peace of God surpasses, I can never say that word, surpasses, something like that. I guess you get what I'm trying to say. It surpasses all understanding, right? And I have felt that peace. So I've had many spiritual experiences. I've had them with God. I've had them with Jesus. I have them with the Holy Spirit. And they are wonderful, right? They feel amazing, which I'm going to tell you guys how to have that. But in near-death experiences, I've never had a near-death experience. But they say they feel such intense joy. It's amazing. So what's actually happening is that temporarily their transcendental connection to God, or the source, has increased, right? And when it increases more and more, it's like they're going up these levels, right? And it starts to match the volatility of God, or at least get closer to it, right? And so the charging intensity reaches extraordinary levels, and they can feel all positive emotions very intensely. Now, you would still, when you're charging, which we'll talk about later, there's still a particular frequency, which you would lean into more and feel more. And I think that just has to do with positive memory. But you'll still notice your ability to feel all positive emotions has increased, right? And so, but yeah, when people have those near-death experiences and they feel that crazy intensity of joy, that reflects a temporary increase in their transcendental connection. And some people have hellish experiences, right? So when they have hellish experience, that represents a temporary decrease in their transcendental connection. And they feel miserable and horrible, right? Far beyond what they felt in human form. And that's because in human form, it usually sits around a range, right? The transcendental connection, or the fourth component. And most people, they don't recognize this fourth component exists. So they'll just notice at certain points in their life, usually when they've engaged in a lot of immoral behavior, we'll talk about that later, it's like they can't feel any positive emotions, right? They just feel negative and miserable. That's because this fourth quantity has decreased, right? They keep thinking that they keep expecting certain experiences to be the same as when this quantity wasn't decreased, and they can't figure out what changed, right? That's because, like I said in book 1, everything we talked about assumed that this quantity was fixed. But if it changes, then everything we talked about also changes. This is kind of the master quantity. One last thing before, which I think we're pretty much done with the video, but one last thing I thought was a kind of novelty I thought was interesting was that in quantum mechanics, and I think I mentioned it before, to describe the state of a quantum particle, you need 4 quantum numbers. So you kind of see something interesting here. The subconscious is kind of the same, right? You need 4 values to fully specify the state of the subconscious, which is intention, frequency, organization, and your connection to God. So I just thought that was interesting and worth mentioning. Not a big deal, but just something I wanted to mention. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So this is the fundamental framework of how everything in the spirit realm works. It pretty much works in some degree. To some degree, it operates from this basic framework. So when you see a lot of spiritual experiences, near-death experiences, or whatever, even dreams, spiritual experiences and dreams, you're going to if you think of it in this framework, I think you'll be able to understand a lot of what happens. Now, there's way more for us to discuss. We're pretty much going to be talking about the consequences of this framework throughout all of book 2, right? So the rest of the book. But this is basically the beginning of how it works. And as we showed here, pretty much all of realities in the spirit realm form as a result of this basic framework, which is your connection to God. All right, so in the next video, I think we're going to talk about how to define God, right? I got to look at it. I forget how I approach it. But we're going to talk about how to define God on a subconscious level, right? I know I do it, but I just don't know if I think I do it in the next section. I'm not sure. But we're going to talk about how to define God subconsciously. Because his nature in knowing him is already built into your subconscious. It makes no difference what you call him or how you think of him on a conscious level. That means nothing. We talked about that in chapter 7. You're going to learn how to define him and know him subconsciously as built into the absolute nature of the subconscious. Right? So yeah, that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.